Hey YouTube, today I'm going to be doing a video tutorial on how to replace the front lower control arm assembly on your 7th generation Honda Civic or your 2nd generation Acura 1.7 EL. This procedure is the same whether you have the sedan or the coupe version of these vehicles. So once I raise the car and secure the front end with some heavy-duty jack stands, as well as firmly applying the parking brake and chocking the rear wheels, I've removed both front wheels, and this is exactly the problem that I'm experiencing in my car. So that you can see here, the front compliance bushing is completely torn, and of course this leads to front end slop and alignment issues, and even actually a clunking noise if it's worn out bad enough. So we're going to go ahead and start taking everything apart. Now, since I'm working on the driver's side wheel, I actually want to rotate the front knuckle to the far right to give me more clearance to begin removing the sway bar end links from the control arm. I turn the steering wheel all the way to the right, such that when I'm doing the driver's side wheel, that it allows me to have maximum access to the sway bar end links. Now if you're doing the passenger side, you're going to want to turn the wheel all the way to the left. Now prior to dismantling any of the bolts on our vehicle, we want to make sure that we want to thoroughly saturate the control arm bolts and all the pieces that connect to it with plenty of penetrating lube. So of course the front compliant bushing, there's a large 19mm head hex bolt, and then on the back side here, if you can sort of see it inside here, there's another one for the rear portion of the control arm. The two end link pieces, one that attaches to the sway bar here, and then the lower one that's attached to the control arm, as well as the lower ball joint right there. So what you want to do is soak them really thoroughly and give it at least 20 minutes, and then maybe in between that to give it another spraying just to make sure that everything has penetrated thoroughly. Now, one of the cheap tricks I like to use when I'm taking apart my sway bar end links, or any suspension components for that matter, is that I like to take my impact gun and just bang this piece loose so that it gets the nut off of the control arm, because sometimes they can be quite tight from factory. However, what we're going to need to do is we're going to have to use a 5mm hex, inside hex, to insert into the end of our end link, and then using our 14mm wrench undo it. Now, worst case scenario is that if this gets all rusted out and you can't, you strip the inside of the hex hole, or it just simply won't budge, then unfortunately we're going to have to use a hacksaw and manually cut these end links off, which can be quite a pain in the ass if they're really bad. Now, how I'm going to get into this end link here is I'm going to use a swivel impact joint with a 14mm short socket on the end, just to break it loose like this. Once that's been loosened, we can then go ahead and take our 5mm hex, just confirm that size for everyone here, 5mm, and jam it in as tightly as you can and as squarely as you can into the hole, and begin undoing the end link. So this is the difference between me soaking the joint, or this end link here, with lots of penetrating lube well in advance before I'm doing this job, and to also keep spraying it as I'm doing it, because, well, it makes a big difference. Now, when you're doing the lower control arm replacement or bushing replacement, I would strongly advise that you just buy a new set of end links. The corrosion that can build up on these things isn't worth the hassle should you ever need to take this out a second time. And so that's how you remove it, like this. Now, I'm not going to necessarily remove the upper portion just yet until I've actually had a chance to remove the control arm, so it'll give me more clearance to take that out. Now, the next component that we need to remove is this cotter pin that's securing this lower castle nut. And how we can do this is that we can actually push this open end of the cotter pin, or sorry, this sort of rounded edge here where the wire is, push it forward and then undo the locking hook, and then just pull it away and remove it from the lower ball joint. Using your 17mm socket, you can either use an impact gun or a ratchet. You just want to break this lower ball joint nut loose. Now, you don't want to actually completely remove it, but what you do want to do is that you want to expose the lower portion of the ball joint that goes into the knuckle, and just get some of your penetrating lube and thoroughly spray some up inside to help the joint come apart easier. Now, we don't want to completely remove the lower ball joint castle nut here, but in fact, once we spray the penetrating lube up inside, we want to actually use our hands and just screw it in such that the actual threaded portion of the ball joint just begins to protrude from the top of our castle nut. And so what I mean by that is, if you can see in the video that there's no exposed threads, but I've essentially increased the surface area in which our ball joint press can make contact with, so that it doesn't mushroom the head of the lower ball joint, which is technically not serviceable by Honda definition, as well as not damaging the castle nut, you know, should we have it out too far like this, and it can actually bend the little raised portion of the nut. So you just want to have it such that the center portion is just sticking out. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to take a flat bladed screwdriver, and we just want to pry up on our boot very carefully here. Now, the reason why is that I find that with the ball joint separator or pickle fork or whatever people want to use to separate these joints, often pinches this rubber here and then tears the boot, and then now you're going to have this grease leak over time where salt and dirt and sand can get inside and then wear the joint out. Now, you need not worry that some grease is going to squeeze out, because it will. It's filled with grease. Not a big deal. I'd rather you not puncture this rubber boot than anything else. Now, the ball joint separator tool I'm going to use looks like this, and you can actually obtain this from your AutoZone or Harbor Freight, and it's a fairly simple tool. It operates like this, where when you're turning this bolt, that it applies pressure to the bottom portion of our ball joint and then basically presses it out like this. So what you want to do here is you want to carefully make sure that this inside portion is lubricated with some grease. So as you can see here, I've actually got some grease kind of squirted on there, and I'm just gonna very carefully just wiggle it back and forth like this to allow it to slide in freely underneath that rubber boot. And that's why you had to separate it with your screwdriver tip, and then making sure that the finger portion makes secure contact with the bottom of the joint. I'm just giving you guys a side profile view of what that would look like. Now, to separate the ball joint, you want to make sure that it's pressed on properly, and then we're going to go ahead and begin hand tightening our tool. Now, you can do this using a wrench and a ratchet, and it takes forever, or you can do what I do and use an impact gun to drive it down to expedite the process. Now, the other reason why you also want to leave that lower ball joint nut on is that when we actually separate this joint, you don't want the control arm that slides off of the bolt to strip the threads, so that helps add a little bit of protection to it as well. Once you hear the ball joint pop off from the lower control arm, go ahead and completely remove the lower control arm nut. As you can see here, there's no mushrooming of the ball joint threads and no bending or damaging of the castle nut's little tips. Using a 19mm socket, proceed to remove the front lower control arm securing bolt. So now we can go ahead and begin undoing the rear lower control arm securing bolt. And using a short, shallow socket and a 1/2-inch drive ratchet, and preferably an extension pipe, you want to very carefully remove this bolt. Now, I should mention that to remove the rear control arm bolt on the right hand side, is a little bit more challenging than it is to do so on the driver's side, because at least here the oil pan clearance allows me to get my ratchet in quite easily. On the passenger side, the transmission's in the way, so you'll find that you can only move like your ratchet one click at a time to remove it. It can be a little bit more time consuming, but not necessarily arduously difficult. Now, as you're undoing these bolts, it always helps to regularly apply some penetrating oil just to make sure that you're not stripping any of the threads. Remove the bolt like this. Now, to remove the lower control arm, it's a fairly straightforward process at this point. We can just give it a wiggle, and the whole thing should just kind of fall out, especially if the bushings are all worn out. And just remove it like so. This is what the front compliance bushing looks like after I just used a pair of pliers to lightly pull on the core that would normally be attached to the inside portion of this arm via the rubber mount points here and here. And so when a control arm compliance bushing goes, then suddenly the suspension geometry begins to kind of go haywire, and then you have all sorts of alignment and handling problems that sort of manifest themselves as a direct result of this failing. So it's not very difficult to replace, and it can mean the world of difference between your car driving properly and it not driving properly. Now, I'd mentioned earlier that we want to remove the lower control arm before we then remove the upper sway bar end link from the sway bar, because it gives us a bit more room, and this definitely makes a world of difference if you've already disconnected the other side. So we're going to now go ahead and undo from the back side our sway bar end link using the same technique used earlier. Unfortunately, in my case, there was not enough corrosion to permanently seize these bad boys inside the threads. But as you can see, there's a fair bit of corrosion on the ends of these things, or at least in my opinion there are. It was a pain in the ass to take out. Now, prior to doing any reinstallation work of any bolts and fasteners on your vehicle, it's always good practice to make sure that you use a product like this called copper anti-seize, made by Permatex, or the gray graphite variation. It doesn't really matter. But the key thing here is that when you coat all your fasteners with this stuff, that it prevents it from corrosion, and it also acts as a lubricant to help make the reinstallation process that much easier. Now, for example, on our lower control arm bolts, you know, they're exposed to all sorts of salt and water and all sorts of disgusting things on the road that can cause them to have quite a bit of corrosion buildup. So another good thing to do is to thoroughly inspect the bolts to make sure there's no excessive corrosion built up on the bolts, as well as making sure that the threads didn't get damaged during the bolt removal process. Now, this also applies to sway bar end links, lower ball joint threads, anything that's threaded and metal on metal contact that's not, like, once it's screwed in doesn't move, should be coated with this. So what I do here is I inspected my screws already, or my bolts, and everything looks good. Now I'm just going to apply a generous amount of this compound onto the bolt. Now, the other thing I want to mention here that'll be easier to show you here than it is under the vehicle is that you'll notice that the lower control arm securing bolts have this non-threaded taper on it, and that actually is an alignment taper, so that if you're trying to get your control arm in, that if you just use your hand and press up firmly and then give the control arm a wiggle while you're pressing, that this bolt will actually seat properly in the threads, and then you can begin hand threading it, not tool threading, but hand threading it back into the body, the frame threads, without risk of damaging anything. So it's great if you've got one of those stubborn control arms that won't line up properly, that you can even actually use a hammer and just gently tap it, and these tapered edges on the bolt will help push that through without screwing up the threads. Now to reinstall this control arm, because we have a new compliance bushing installed, it can be actually quite stiff to try to get it in the same way of how it was removed. So what I find is that it just helps to just directly press the front portion of the bushing all the way into the frame, and there's actually enough give on the bushing where you can kind of flex it down and go underneath the knuckle like this, and then ultimately have it slide into the back frame channel. Now if it doesn't want to go in on the rear side, you can actually use a mallet like this and just give it a few gentle taps while pressing in to get everything to line up. Now you may need to do some back and forth tapping with your mallet and even maybe use a pry bar to get things lined up, but once you have things generally aligned properly, you can then go ahead and then carefully use your mallet again to tap the sort of self-aligning screws into the frame. And then using a ratchet and not necessarily an impact gun, you can loosely install the front lower control arm bolt. Under no circumstances should you feel any friction or cross-threading while installing these bolts. They should go in smooth as butter every time. Do not completely tighten the bolt and go ahead and reinstall the rear securing bolt. Using a wiggling motion, wiggle your control arm back and forth while pressing down on the bolt head until you can feel it align with the rear holes. And then using your ratchet, proceed to tighten. Much like the front bolt, there should be almost no effort in screwing this bolt back in. If you're not sure if the bolt is threading in properly, try giving it a pull after you've given it a few turns. If it doesn't come out, then you know that the threads have started properly. Once the rear lower bolt has been tightened securely, go ahead and tighten the front bolt completely. Now anytime you pop off your ball joint, it's always a good idea to give the joint a thorough cleaning with a clean towel or rag, and just inspect the boot for any tears or holes or punctures to ensure that, or to confirm at least, that you didn't damage the boot during the ball joint separation process. Now on this one, there's clearly no signs of any splits anywhere because they normally would rip right here. And of course, once I've cleaned everything up, now is also a good time to check your ball joints by giving them a good wiggle by hand, up and down and back and forth, and they should be fairly tight and require some considerable effort to move around. Normally when ball joints are badly worn, if I pull up on the shaft, there'll be play, but in this case there's none, so I know my joints are good. Now before we reinstall the knuckle back under the control arm, you want to actually make sure that the front wheels are now centered. Now prior to reinstalling the lower ball joint onto the lower control arm, we want to make sure that our CV axle here doesn't have any weird twists and kinks along the joint, on the outboard joint as well as the inboard joint. And the reason why is that sometimes when you're moving the steering knuckle in and out from the vehicle in this manner, you can actually dislodge some of the internal joints here in the CV axle, which could then cause very rapid wear as well as some major alignment and drivability issues. So as long as the axle in its natural sort of resting position, and this is why you had to turn the steering wheel straight, is that then any kinks or any pops inside the joint would be clearly visible, because this would be all kind of mangled and funny looking on the boot. So making sure that our ball joint shaft is nice and clean here on the bottom, we can just press down on the control arm and then just using a bit of muscle here, we can then reattach or push that ball joint thread through the lower control arm. And if you can't do it, having a helper is always useful. Again, once it's popped in, you want to check to make sure that there's no weird bends in that boot. And then reinstall the lower ball joint securing nut. Reinstall the lower ball joint securing cotter pin. Making sure that you press the pin all the way through and that it hooks on the hook end, latches back onto one of the cutout portions on the nut so that it can't work its way loose. Alright, so now the last step into our reassembly process is to install a set of new end links onto our sway bar. And so, very much like what we did with our control arm bolts, we're just going to go ahead and thoroughly coat the threads on our end links with some anti-seize. Once we've hand threaded the nuts on, we can now go ahead and just hold the center core of our end link and proceed to just hand tighten them. Now if you find on the driver's side that you have a lot of trouble trying to tighten the inner, the back side of the sway bar end link, it sometimes helps to get like a wrench set like this, which is called a stubby wrench, and by comparison it's considerably shorter than a normal size wrench. And so I find that having a set of them often helps when you're in a tight bind. And there you have it. So as you can see from my video, removing and replacing your lower control arm on your 7th generation Honda Civic or 2nd generation Acura 1.7 EL is a fairly straightforward process. I've used a few basic hand tools, and fortunately I've got access to some air tools that helped facilitate the removal and reinstallation process. So basically the procedures for the passenger side is exactly the same. And while I was doing so, I was also able to replace my suspension sway bar end links with some new pieces that are actually better quality than the factory Honda ones. I just want to mention that once you've tightened everything down on your suspension, that you ensure that you book yourself an appointment to get an alignment done on your vehicle, as the geometry of the suspension is now where it needs to be, and of course the steering wheel and how the tires align to the vehicle is likely going to be off. I hope you found this video useful and informative. Rate, comment, and subscribe.